I'm here with the wonderful Robin Rothenberg, and I'm a big fan. I know Robin for quite a few years. I'm not sure how many, but it has to be 10
Since
anyway.
2016. So
Yeah,
yeah, we're coming
okay,
up on our 10th anniversary soon.
thinking so. And Robin has a wonderful book called Restoring Prana. And I really want to delve into breathing and yoga and to look at the potential, Robin, because sometimes I feel that yoga instructors, they're kind of missing out a little bit on the potential that breathing has to offer both the student and also the instructor. So we'll start off with just a little bit of your background because I know you have a huge experience in teaching yoga, a few decades. So I'll hand over to you. You're very
Or
welcome. 4 decades. Wow, that's
just about,
huge.
I cannot, I always know because my youngest daughter, I started practicing yoga when she was born. She's almost 39. So yeah, so it's like that. Mhm.
And when you started teaching, was it mainly just, it was, I suppose you trained as a yoga instructor and then you started working with students and then you changed kind of directions over the year. You're quite inquisitive.
I am. I'm a curious person. That's just how I'm always wanting to learn more. And I think it's helpful to understand like what came before I started yoga, which was and kind of got me into it was which was I had chronic health and issues and chronic pain in my body. And I was always sickly as a child, which is all tied into the breath and meeting you and all that years and years later. If only we had met earlier. But whatever, things happen as they do. So when I started yoga, I was drawn to teachers who were adapting yoga I needed a lot of adaptations. I couldn't just like put my hands down on the floor. I had a very tight body, I had a very deconditioned body. I loved it, but I started injuring myself through the intensity of the physical practices. So I kept having to adapt for myself. And then I was drawn to teachers who had a lot of wisdom and understanding about how to adapt for different body types as opposed to everybody do it this way. And it made more sense to me. And so I naturally became a teacher that was more fluent in adaptation. And so then who came to me were students like myself who were not your typical like hyperflexy, I can do anything, I was a dancer, I can move, but the people who were like, I have trouble moving and I have shoulder issues and I have back issues and these kinds of things. So I didn't know it at the time, but I was naturally already drawn towards therapeutic adaptation. So then when I met Gary Kraftstyle, who became my my therapeutic yoga teacher and trained me in yoga therapy and certified me in yoga therapy, um, that was just like a natural fit because everything was adapted. And in addition to the physical postures, there was a lot of emphasis that he brought on into breathing and the effect of the breath on the mind and the effect of the breath on movement and on the heart and the connection to the inner self and a lot of deep study of yoga philosophy. And so yoga got from then on taken out of the box of it's all about posture and movement and flexibility and all of that hoo-ha, which it's not, and then became this very deep, rich body, mind, heart, soul, practice of transformation. And so from there, I found myself working consistently with people with chronic pain and chronic health issues and using all the different tools of yoga to including lifestyle and Ayurveda to really help them to become more have a greater sense of agency in their own lives and to feel like they could do, even if they had a condition, they could still feel better as a human being with the condition, a person with the condition, but not defined and limited by that condition in terms of their sense of well-being. So it's been very rewarding work. And then I became a trainer in yoga therapy and am very involved in the International Association of Yoga Therapists, working with our profession to bring it into healthcare and have it accepted as a healthcare practice in not just in the United States, but internationally. So I'm very dedicated to this work and I love sharing it with yoga teachers who really want to understand the depth and the breadth, not the breath, but also the breath of yoga, what yoga can offer.
And then you had your own journey, okay? You mentioned in terms of chronic pain, and I love the way you talked about you were struggling a little bit yourself, which caused you to start, wondering, is there a different way to do it? And I think that can give you a tremendous experience. The teacher who has been through that and worked their way through it, because if a teacher finds everything so easy, they expect that their students will pick it up so easy. But when we struggle a little bit with our own issues, and when we can help to master them, at least make some progress, we have an in-depth understanding then to help the students who are struggling. I think quite a few people can be struggling, though. It's across all walks of life.
For sure. And I would say the struggles are increasing because of the level of stress that people are carrying in the world. And so all of that stress, that emotional and mental stress, affects how they feel in their body and can make their body and their mind more vulnerable to disease, dis-ease.
Yeah, dis-ease.
So
And then in terms of you have asthma, and I know your story is small, but you met Pippa.
Yes. Yes. So I have my whole life struggled with respiratory issues. I was never diagnosed as having asthma, although I still think back to this ridiculous doctor at one point when I was a teenager who said, "Oh, you have COPD," and then like never said anything else about it. It's like I think back to that and I'm like, what
But
an odd
that's an
thing
awful statement to say to somebody just off straight
I
off
was
the
like
bat.
18 and I'm thinking, and if you really believe that to be true, did you not think that there was something you should, but the reason was because I coughed all the time. I never wheezed, but I coughed all the time. And so I was when I had a lot of strep throat and tonsillitis. When I say a lot, and ear infections, like almost every other week, I was on some kind of antibiotic. I was sick all the time in the winter.
And can I ask, were you a chronic mouth breather, do you think?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I was for sure a chronic mouth breather. And my brothers, I had my adenoids out, not my tonsils then, but I had them out later. But I had my adenoids out when I was 4, and I had older brothers, and they used to tease me about my snoring.
See, this is really interesting because just before we got on, you were talking about having work done and you've had your lower jaw, I'm
Upper
assuming
jaw,
your upper
the
jaw,
whole thing.
your lower jaw, all widened to help open up the airway. And then you talk about having enlarged adenoids, which of course is the lymphatic tissue at the back of the nose. So just in our little model here,
Yeah.
it's this tissue here that's enlarged. And when this is enlarged, well, the child is not going to breathe through the nose. So therefore, with Robin and with many, many children, their adenoids are enlarged. They don't feel comfortable breathing through their nose, so they breathe through their mouth. And this causes a huge impact on the craniofacial development that lasts lifelong. And even this should be put into yoga students because how many
I
of them have their own
know.
kids?
I know. I mean, because of all that I've gone through with the breath transformation, and we'll get into that, like how I shifted from traditional pranayama to incorporate so much of what I've learned from you into understanding pranayama, like really understanding pranayama, and then transforming how I teach breathing. But then the reconstruction piece, because I mean, I did transfer, I'm not a mouth breather, and I have a very, very functional breathing, both biomechanically and biochemically. But that was not going to change the deforming of my of my jaw and my throat. It was not going to increase my airway. I had to actually have structural surgery, multiple surgeries to do that, and I still have aligners, and I have 3 more months of them. But I mean,
You've 3 more months of
wearing aligners.
aligners.
To yeah, my jaw's where it needs to be, but my bite isn't.
Yeah.
So they're refining my bite now so that I can actually chew things like salad and apples and carrots and things. I can't do that.
Sleep in women, and I'm only starting to do a deep dive in it because I have a book due that has to be written by January. And sleep in women, Dr. Christian Guilleminault, who's a really important figure in sleep medicine.
Right.
He said that women were the forgotten gender, that a lot of the focus is on men. Now, you talked about your small airway, so you're talking about the space at the back of the nose and at the back of the mouth and the throat itself. And if you have an airway the size of a big biro, regardless of what you're doing, air isn't going to travel so freely. But if you go and do a sleep study, it doesn't necessarily register as having moderate to severe sleep apnea. But here's the thing with women that I only came across recently. If a female has an AHI, which is a measurement of the severity, between 2 and 5 events per hour, which is nothing. Well, is it? It's equivalent to men with an AHI of 10 to 15 events per hour. And females respond much differently with their sleep issues different to men. They're more likely to have stress, anxiety, panic disorder, probably craniofacial pain, and other aspects going on. And this often goes under the radar. So, Robin, when we're having this discussion, we're a lot of people who could be attending yoga, of course, for high stress levels, poor sleep, and they're getting that help. But then we have to ask the question, how are they breathing and how is their airway?
Exactly. Exactly. And and so I, since working with Pippa, which people are like, well, who's Pippa? She's a wonderful person who was a long, long time yoga student of mine and had severe asthma. When I met her, she never was without her inhaler, like rested on her mat because she was having horrific attacks and would end up in the hospital regularly, in spite of being on very high doses of all the medications. And so at some point, her pulmonologist suggested Buteyko breathing. And she reported back to me and said, I'm doing this breathing. It's making a huge difference. I've been able to reduce my medications. At one point, she was off of them, went trekking in Nepal. I mean, she's an incredible woman. And I watched her go through that process. And she said, I'm no longer going to breathe the way you and the other instructors are instructing in class. I love your classes, but I'm going to breathe in the way that works for me. And I said, God bless you, please do. Right. And I was, there was that little inkling of curiosity. Like, I wonder what she's doing that's so different.
You weren't insulted though, no?
No, I don't get
You seen her
insulted.
struggle.
I get more curious, but I do get arrogant. So that did come into play. So I invited her to come and do like a little info webinar on Buteyko, and she did, and I was really fascinated. And I thought the information was really interesting. I even brought the whole idea of the CO2 syndrome into my yoga therapy training. But this is where the arrogance came in. But I did pranayama. So like I didn't need that. Like I was good with, like this ancient teaching about the breath. I felt like I was in good hands, had studied with these wonderful teachers in the yoga lineages who really knew deeply what they were doing. So I just figured that was all good. And I didn't need what she was offering because at that point I had never been diagnosed with asthma. And my coughing was, and my health was good. My energy was good. My coughing was pretty mild at that point. But then I started teaching more and talking more. And there was more stress as a result of a variety of family health issues all around me with my mom, my husband. Anyway, a lot of different things kind of came together in a perfect storm where I started having the health issues that I had when I was growing up. I was coughing all the time. I was tired. I was weak. I had brain fog. I couldn't stop yawning, like all of these things. And I started getting respiratory infections and not being able to like fight them off. And I'm thinking, this isn't right. Like I'm going backwards. Like I came so far with my health and now I'm going backwards. I don't know what's wrong. And then I went to my naturopath and she had me, breathe into the barometer. And she was like, oh my God, Robin, that's horrible. You have asthma. I'm like, I do not. She's like, no, really, you do. This is bad. You need like inhalers. You're not gonna like. You need steroids. Like you need help, lady. And of course, they did help. I never used an inhaler in my life. Like, and I've had so many coughing jags for like 20, 30 minutes. Like horrible, horrible, horrible. I've cracked ribs from coughing so hard. So anyway, that got me thinking. The asthma piece, like that she labeled that, it was like, oh, I better call Pippa. It's like immediately, like, I know where to go. I've got to go outside my wheelhouse because obviously everything I've tried isn't working. And I don't want to be on meds for the rest of my life. Like, something here is off with my breathing. So I started working with her, and that, you know, opened a whole new world. Like everything I learned in yoga school about deep, big breaths, like really expanding the chest and the ribs, and like, right. And, we weren't actually exhaling through the mouth, but back then, nobody did that back then. That's a new made up thing that none of my very, very knowledgeable and deeply studied yoga teachers ever taught. It's a
Wow.
new thing. Like, new as in, I've been practicing for 40 years. None of my teachers in the first 20 years that I was studying regularly, intensively training, nobody ever said breathe through your mouth, ever.
Wow.
It's a new thing, and yoga people, stop it now. It's not yoga, it's not pranayama, and it's not healthy. Patrick and I, both of us, could go into a long lecture on why it's not healthy, but please stop it.
Totally. Absolutely. But I'm kind of a little bit intrigued by that. I find that amazing. Now, you know what's coming into my mind though? So you then switched to Buteyko. What was the difference between the Buteyko methods and the pranayama that you're teaching? And then the second question that I'm going to ask is, was original pranayama closer to Buteyko than we think?
Yeah,
Did it
so
get lost?
this is actually the reason why I wrote the book, as you know,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
and so I'm happy to share this. So first of all, what happened to me was literally like night and day. So before I went to see Pippa, it was on a Monday or something, like, let's just say it was Monday. So Saturday, Sunday, and for the 3 months before, I actually had not had a solid night's sleep because I was coughing all night long. Like, literally, I tell my husband, go sleep in the guest room because I'm just going to keep you up. I can't, I would have to sit up, and I would be sitting up trying to do different pranayamas to stop the bronchial spasms, to stop the tickle, trying everything I knew. And I was just getting more and more exhausted. I was having these horrible coughing jags. Like I said, like I had like the symptoms of chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia, which had like chased me my
This,
whole life.
Robin, I'm going to step in, as well.
Yeah,
Sorry now, because when you mentioned fibromyalgia, that was actually one of the symptoms of upper airway resistance syndrome, which is tying in with your small airway. Plus, you had
yeah,
breathing issues and you
yeah,
had mouth open and things like that.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly. So of course, I didn't correlate. I came to correlate it all and be like, oh my God, this is what's been like, all these different problems throughout my entire life could go back to, and I'm not blaming my mom, but like not being breastfed, like, and not developing my jaw, my tongue, and all these things that we know now are so critically important to health and well-being. But that's just the way my life was set up. And then my dad was a doctor, so prescribing antibiotics was sort of what you did if your kid's sick, and I had all these infections. And so he was doing his best too. They didn't know, right? And meanwhile, feeding me, milk and toast, gluten and dairy in large quantities. And, it's just like, anyway, all not good. My gut biome, everything was just going in the wrong direction. So I can put all those pieces together now, and am happy to help others to not fall down that toboggan run, or have their children go that route too, right? Um, Through education. But in any case, I was having all these symptoms, a lot of brain fog. I mean, it was scary. It was scary to feel so awful again, to wake up and be like so achy and not tired. I mean, wake up, I barely slept. So I go and I do this 2-hour class with Pippa, and I do what I breathe in the class the way that she's telling me to breathe, which is like very little, like tiny breath. And I'm doing these breath holds, and I don't know what it does. It's like so bizarre, but I'm fascinated because my curious mind, like, this is so bizarre. Like, I'm doing this thing and I'm feeling better. Like, within 24 hours. I mean, the story. My husband literally said, he was sleeping with me at that point, and he said, you scared me last night. I said, why? He said, you were so quiet. I thought you were dead. Literally, because he was so used to my snoring and my noisiness at night, hearing me breathe all night. And then I was so quiet. So it was dramatic. So within a week, my coughing had reduced by 75%. And when somebody, please understand, if somebody's got a chronic cough, it means they're basically their insides are being violently agitated, irritated, and inflamed from top to bottom, and it's damaging. I mean, I will go into it as detailed as you want, but honestly, I've had multiple surgeries as a result of chronic coughing. It's not something that you want to just let go for yourself or anybody that you're in contact with.
Yeah.
So anyway, so the not coughing was huge for me, and I started feeling like my brain was clicking on all cylinders again, and I had energy, and I was sleeping better, and I'm like, okay, I need to understand this, right? So I'm like, Pippa, I need books. I want to understand it. So second class, literally, it was a 5-week series. Came in the second week. I need more information. So she gave me some books, and I'm like reading books, your book. And I'm like, I gotta train in this. I have to understand the science behind it. I've got a science mind. So I'm like looking, and your training was like in April. I'm like, I'm going to Ireland in April. I'm going to study. I don't know who this dude is, but I'm going to go study with him because he seems to know something about this. I'm going to go there and I'm going to learn more about this. And by the time I got to you, I was already much healthier and much more functional. And then, of course, you just, brought so much rich information to me. I was just flooded with all the things that I didn't know about breathing. And I was working with people with severe chronic health issues. And I was teaching breathing. And what I was learning from you is everything. And I was teaching yoga teachers to use those same techniques that I learned from my teacher that hadn't worked for me. Yeah. Right? I mean, worked to a point and then didn't work anymore. So then I'm sitting in your office as you're going through these PowerPoints and showing all these studies that have been done and all this stuff about the airway and the chronic inflammation and CO2 levels and nitric oxide, which I've never heard anybody talk about before in all of my trainings. And I'm like, I have to learn this and I have to share this with the yoga community, because how can we call ourselves breathing experts and we don't know this stuff? And I was honestly, I'm going to be a little bit, I'll bring my arrogance back for this moment. I studied with the best yoga teachers around who really had studied deeply with teachers in India and took this whole therapeutic understanding of yoga very seriously. And they were not teaching what I learned from you in terms of the science, respiratory physiology, the science of the breath, and what functional breathing is and what constitutes functional breathing. So it's learning pranayama, but not from a place of understanding what's health, what's healthy breathing. And the pranayamas are manipulating the breath in a variety of ways, which the yogis were doing, but they had very different lifestyle. And my contention is they were functional breathers, so they could do all kinds of stuff, right? They could manipulate and have different experiences as a result of where their starting point is. But if you're starting with people who are highly stressed and people who aren't sleeping and aren't digesting and have chronic pain and chronic health issues, and you have them do these extreme breathings that are manipulating their breath in a way where you're taking them from dysfunction and pushing them more into dysfunction, it's going to create more health issues, not take them in the direction of health. And this was my big fear. As I'm listening to you, I'm like, oh my God, we are in trouble here if we don't get our breath facts straight. We have to learn about this so we can actually utilize some beautiful tools of pranayama that refine what I've learned from you in a even more exacting and adaptive way. There's a nice blend there, but you have to understand and get people to functional breathing first.
There's a couple of great points you made there. One was the comparison that when you were doing Buteyko, that you were going the opposite from taking full breaths to what people would characteristically call shallow breaths. Now, the objective, of course, of the shallow breath or light breath is to minimize your airflow to allow carbon dioxide to accumulate in the lungs and blood. And that in turn will help to improve blood circulation and oxygen delivery. So there's quite a big comparison there. But if you were to look at pranayama, when you were doing the research for your book, Restoring Prana, and you looked back where you could get information, there's 2 points you made. One was that the original yogi masters were living a life that they had functional breathing. And clearly, that's not the same life that we are all living today. And I would say that a lot of people that go to yoga possibly go there to help deal with stress.
Yeah,
And
for sure.
75% of people with anxiety and panic disorder have dysfunctional breathing. And then if you add
Yes.
full deep breaths on top of their already poor breathing, it can have the opposite effect. So the 2 points would be carbon dioxide is often considered as a waste gas. So when you're in your yoga practice, or you're talking to your students and your therapists, what way would you instruct the breath in order to be able to, and what do your yoga students think of it? How do you, because they must have some roadblocks, because I'm just thinking if I've been told to take full breaths for quite a few years, and now here comes Robin Rothenberg, and she's telling me to do the opposite, how do you overcome that?
Yeah. So I want to address that, but I also don't want to lose that really wonderful question that you asked about the original teachings on pranayama, because when I did my research after, like I came back from studying with you and I was like, like, how could this be? Because I have such strong faith and trust in the yoga teachings, right? How could there be this incongruency between taking these big audible breaths in and audible breaths out. And then this, I call it subtle. I'm not into the word shallow, right? Like subtle breath. And then, so then I started looking back into the original teachings of pranayama and the original teaching on pranayama, there's a lot of, from different lineages. India is a really big country. Different stories get told and passed down through different lineages in different ways. But there's one point that was consistent through all of the books and the teachers who had looked at all the original texts and kind of coalesced that information into like pranayama is the word pranayama is synonymous with the word kumbhaka. Kumbhaka is the space between the inhale and the exhale and the space between the exhale and the inhale. It's the pause. Pranayama is not the moving part of the breath. Pranayama is the capacity to not breathe and be comfortable. And we know that that only happens if you have a certain level of carbon dioxide in your system, because if your CO2 levels are low, you're going to want to breathe more and more and more and more. So even though they didn't talk about CO2, the fact that the sign of being a master of pranayama was the ability to suspend the breath for longer and longer and longer periods of time. The only way you can do that is by reducing your breath volume. You can't breathe more and get there. It's impossible. And furthermore, the other point of connection is the connection between the mind and the breath. And this does tie into how I help to transform skeptics who are like, but my teacher said, like, okay, but do we agree that the second sutra in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is the classic teaching on yoga, which is the second sutra defines yoga as this: yoga chitta vritti nirodha, which means yoga is the cessation, stopping of the movement of the mind, the quieting and the stillness of the mind. So there's this idea of the ultimate state of yoga is this calm, clear, open, spacious mind, not our usual distracted, cluttered, chattery, busy mind, but like total stillness. And furthermore, breath and mind go together. So it's said that they wag each other's tails. So the more breath, the faster, bigger the breath, the faster, bigger the thoughts. And the slower and calmer and stiller the breath, the slower, calmer, stiller the mind. So if the ultimate goal of yoga is to still the mind, how can we get there by all over the place? It's not possible. It's incongruent. It just doesn't make any sense. So when I put those pieces together, that's when I was like, okay, now I know how to write the book. I know I can take all of this respiratory science and the Buteyko practices that I've learned from Patrick, and I can actually put them in context to yoga and say, this is not yoga. This is actually yoga. This is actually what the teachings are guiding us towards. And somewhere we got lost in the translation and the transmission, but we can get back to it.
Can I just come in? So when you're then working with your students,
yeah,
you could still be teaching the same yoga instructions, but just adding specific nuances to make sure that your students don't hyperventilate. So if they're really having that longer breath in, you're making sure that the tidal volume is almost minimal, that there's a conservation of the breath. And by doing that, you're going to allow carbon dioxide to accumulate in the lungs and blood. And as carbon dioxide accumulates, the organ that gets affected probably the quickest is the brain, because blood flow to the brain increases, oxygen delivery to the brain increases, and brain cells quieten down. So, because I think sometimes, Robin, people will think, well, I'm doing slow breathing. And in theory, then slow breathing, quieter mind. But your point was you could be doing slow breathing, and even though you're focusing on slowing down the respiratory rate, you're taking in such a full breath in the process that your minute volume is too high, which is causing reduced blood flow and oxygen delivery to the brain. You know, I wonder how many people are in a yoga class and are over breathing, but they don't even know that they are over breathing, but they may have symptoms of dizziness. They may be feeling excessively breathless or lightheaded. And it's kind of, you get on with it, maybe.
Oh yeah. And then there's hot yoga where the temperature of the room is really high, which we know increases respiratory rate. So they're right. And then we won't even talk about what they do with the breath. You'd be horrified. But anyway, so, it's a hyperventilation practice. And then there are some breathing practices that induce hyperventilation. But again, understanding those, now I feel like I understand them in context. It's not like I ban them or that they're bad. I understand them in context, and I understand when and how to utilize them, when they're useful, when they're not useful, and how to utilize them, and to balance that with breath suspension so that the net is a positive. So there's ways, it's like the yogis understood this, but they didn't have as explicit a user manual as I think we need today. And also, again, these practices were developed by people who had very low social lives because they were spending hours and hours a day in deep states of meditation. And when they weren't meditating, they were physically like working, doing something with their body to, whatever, they were fetching water, they were, building fire, but, like they had to like function in the world. They couldn't just go into a manufactured home and go to the grocery store. They had to like find their food, harvest it, prepare it, whatever. They had to eat something, even if they were eating lightly, right? And so there was that, and they weren't eating processed food, and they weren't eating sugars, and they weren't eating a bunch of gunk like we eat on a regular basis, right? And overeating. So all of those things contributed to them having a very different kind of nervous system than ours is. And so with the nervous system being set at a more, calm and parasympathetic, level, their breathing is going to be more functional to begin with. So what were able to do in terms of breath manipulation, okay, fine. I'm not an elite athlete either. So I don't expect I'm a good mover, and I am very physically active and well coordinated, but I'm not Cirque du Soleil person, right? You know, like I have to keep it in perspective. I'm not a prima ballerina. I play around with tango, but that doesn't make me, you know, like a professional dancer. So, you know, in the same way, like I'm a good functional breather now, and I can play a little bit with the breath on the ends, but I am not what they were. I don't have that lifestyle. I still like, you know, a glass of wine or a shot of bourbon every once in a while, you know, like, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, totally. We have to live a life. So then when you're working with your students, you're going to be conscious that some students are going to breathe differently because we just don't all breathe the same. We have different respiratory rates, different tidal volumes, whether we're breathing high, whether we're breathing low, and even all of the factors that are feeding into breathing, such as the cognitive experience, the psychophysiological element of it. In that breathing, it's simple and it's complex at the same time. Do you
Exactly.
then tailor? So if you're giving instructions, do you assess your students' breathing and do you tailor exercises to them?
Oh, yeah. Not just, so first of all, yes. I mean, so to put in context, I don't do at this point in my life, I did for years, but I no longer teach like a typical yoga class, right? I do yoga therapy. I work with people one on one with chronic health and chronic pain issues, chronic stress, usually some combination of all three, right? And often now, since the book and my reputation in the world of breathing, I get a lot of people coming in with long COVID and asthma and respiratory issues, um, more than I did prior. So there's that sort of specialty that I've cultivated, but it's not the only thing that I see people for. I always do breath assessment, both biomechanical as well as getting a sense of where they are in terms of their CO2 tolerance. And and then I always, regardless of what they're in to see me for, like I'm the first place is the breath. I mean, it's rare that I don't address the breath initially. You know, I mean, I understand because of my training in anatomy as well that, for instance, somebody has low back pain, they're likely not a functional breather. They're likely a chest breather, and their core muscles are not engaging well in sync with their diaphragm, and that's affecting their lower back. So, in order, I can give them all the back exercises, whatever, and not change their breathing pattern, and they might have some positive results, but they're not going to have the level of positive results as they will if I combine functional breathing biomechanically, get them abdominal diaphragmatic breathing, relax their neck and shoulders, right? And get them really on board with that and breathing at a lighter, lower rate. All of that is going to help their lower back. Likewise, if they have chronic neck and shoulder pain, I can tell you 100% they're chest breathers. And they're 20, 30,000 times a day, they're tensing up here. So again, I've got to get them abdominal diaphragmatically breathing so that they're not chronically stressing out their neck and shoulders and relaxing their jaw and all of that stuff. I can give them all the stretching, strengthening for their upper back. But if I don't help transform their breathing pattern, they're still going to have pain because, as we know, breath rules. There isn't any movement pattern more pervasive in the body than the movement of the breath.
Yeah.
20, 30,000 times we're repeating whatever we're repeating unconsciously. So if we don't consciously change that on the biomechanical level, it's going to affect our structure. And then that chronic tension is going to affect our nervous system. It's going to affect our mind, agitate everything. It's going to make us breathe harder, faster, more stress, right? It's what the yogi said, the mind and the breath wag each other's tail. So you can't, there is no, well, breathing's over here, and then I'm going to do these postures over here, and then we'll talk about the mind over here. For me, it's all the same soup, all the ingredients in the soup of what it means to be a human being. And so I'm always doing breath assessment and then customizing not just what I do with them, but also how I cue them, because different minds hear different things, you know? Like I worked with a marine biologist at one point who had some dysfunctional breathing problems, and she had some neck and shoulder and low back stuff. And somehow it just came to me like, he's a marine biologist, like jellyfish breathing, like I saw the jellyfish. And now I incorporate jellyfish breathing in so much of what I do because, like the jellyfish, it looks like the diaphragm, it moves like the diaphragm. As soon as I said that, she was like, oh, I love that. So then I was like, oh, bingo, jellyfish breathing. For some people, that's going to be a really great visual. Somebody who got stung by a jellyfish, not so much. I won't use that image, right?
Um,
So it's all connected.
and it's even more connected than we think because, say, for example, if somebody is breathing high, we have to ask then, why might they be breathing upper chest? And in some instances, it can be that they're feeling that they are not getting enough air. Their drive to breathe is quite strong because their chemosensitivity to the gas carbon dioxide, which is the primary driver to breathe, is strong, which can happen very often with people who've experienced trauma, high stress, etc. So if then the goal is to restore breathing from a biomechanical point of view, it's important then to, I'm going to put it back to you, to breathe in and out through the nose, but also to consider how do you breathe outside of the yoga studio.
Oh yeah.
That
Yeah.
tie-in is interesting as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, what our personal experience informs so much of what really sticks, right? So years and years ago, one of my favorite yoga teachers, Ramanan Patel, he helped me so much through a lot of the physical structural pain issues that I had. And I just will always hold him dear in my heart. And I remember him saying, breathe through your nose in class, right? Like always instructing, breathe through your nose. And so in yoga class, I always breathe through my nose. I mean, I breathe big, but nobody ever told me. I think back, it's like, Ramanan, I would have listened to you. Like, I believed anything you told me because, he was like a guru to me in that way. I'm like, why didn't you tell me breathe through your nose when you're not in class? It would have changed my life, right? So that's one of the most important things that I teach, not just my clients, but my therapy students who are in my training programs, right? Is you have to get people to understand that how they breathe most of the time is how they are programming their body to breathe. And how, no matter how much they love yoga, they're not going to spend likely more than an hour in practice, most less than that. So what's more important is how they're breathing when they're not practicing yoga. When they're not doing their breathing exercises, they still have to breathe through their nose and they have to breathe lightly. And they have to be sensitive to the pausing. And they have to be aware if they're like me, an enthusiastic teacher that's going to like that. Make sure after the podcast is over, shut to the mouth, do some breath suspensions, recoup what was lost in the midst of the, like, there has to be that counterbalance, an appreciation for the fluctuations of the breath depending on what one is doing with one's life.
I'm conscious of our time because I know you're quite
Yes.
busy today, so we might end up just quickly with the last question. The
Yeah.
power of breath in yoga. Might some yoga instructors be a little bit put off in terms of feeling that it's a bit too complex, or can it be just simplified in a way that they can make it accessible, that they understand it, that you don't have to be necessarily, like, it can be taught simply to students, but there's a power in it. Just even talking about that last sentence, the power of breathing in yoga, going that little bit deeper to enhance the service of your students.
Yeah. So, I mean, I want to say this to all the yoga teachers out there listening. Yoga is not simple. Yoga is rich and deep and profound. And it covers literally every dimension of the human being, what it means, as I said, to be human. So please don't simplify it. Learn more than asana. Asana is the least of it. And I love movement and I love asana, but there's so much more. Please be curious. Please study deeper. And the breath can be taught simply, but the more educated you are, the less likely you're going to be passing on misinformation, miseducating your students, and potentially leading them down a path where it's going to increase their anxiety, increase their stress, increase their pain, increase their lack of sleep, their poor digestion, right? And instead you could be one of the teachers who's actually out there teaching breathing in a way that enhances and supports health and well-being, as was written in the yoga text. It says, through pranayama, through the capacity to suspend the breath for longer periods of time, one becomes like luminous in the mind, healthy and vibrant in the body, needing less food, less sleep, because one has greater vital capacity. It's right in there. But if you're not taking yourself or your students in that direction. And, I have a 18-month program specifically designed to teach and train yoga teachers and yoga therapists, because even as a yoga therapist, I wasn't trained correctly, right? On how to teach pranayama in this way, incorporating this wonderful information I've learned from you and the techniques from Buteyko, and bringing it and putting it into the context of yoga. It's a deep program. It's like a graduate level program. It's self-paced, but it's not a one size fits all. But you can start by stopping the mouth breathing, stopping the big breathing, quiet it all down, quieten it. I hear you, Patrick, like you're beautiful. But quieten the breath, just soften the breath, right? But it's like that. It's like less, make it lighter, less, calm down all of that movement so one can actually rest. It's so much more restful. There isn't anybody that I've trained in this way who's come from that world of big breathing who has said, this was interesting. It's kind of an experiment, but I really want to go back to that. When I take them back, sometimes I do that just for the heck of it, like go back to the big breathing, and they're like, oh my God, that feels horrible.
Yeah, you can't
Nobody
unlearn
wants
it.
to go back.
You can't unlearn it. Robin, your website, your book, I have a book as well, Breathing for Yoga, and your book is so referenced throughout it. So
Thank
your
you,
book
Patrick.
is Restoring Prana.
Restoring Prana. The whole title is Restoring Prana, a therapeutic guide to pranayama and healing through the breath. And it has a companion workbook called the Svadhyaya, which is self-awareness breath journal. And it's for the practices in the where you can actually keep track and do the practices from the Restoring Prana book, and really have a place where you can track yourself. And these are the manuals that we use for the Restore Your Prana training program. My website is essentialyogatherapy.com. And please feel free to reach out and contact me and check out the trainings that I offer in yoga therapy.
It has been a
And
pleasure.
Patrick,
As
always
always.
a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much, Robin. That's brilliant.
Thank
And I
you.
think you'll help a lot of people in the way. So thank you so much.
You bet.